Stop carrying weakness into 2026. Another year approaches, and many people feel the same quiet weight they carried before. Not because life has been unusually cruel, but because nothing essential has changed inside them. The same reactions, the same habits, the same fears, postponed again under the language of hope and renewal. Stoicism does not begin with optimism. It begins with clarity. It asks you to look directly at what you have become through repeated choices, tolerated thoughts, and unexamined impulses. It asks whether the life you are living is governed by reason or by reflex, by principle or by appetite, by inner order or by whatever pressure happens to be loudest. Weakness, in the Stoic sense, is not a moral insult. It is not a judgment of worth. It is simply the condition of a mind that has not been trained to stand on its own. A mind that depends on circumstances to feel steady. A mind that reacts before it judges. A mind that confuses comfort with good and pain with harm. Modern life quietly rewards this condition. It offers endless distraction from thought, endless reassurance without substance, endless outrage without responsibility. It teaches you to express every emotion, but to examine none. To demand fairness from the world, while neglecting self-command. The Stoics warned that this way of living leads not to freedom, but to bondage. Bondage to moods, bondage to opinions, bondage to events you do not control. As 2026 approaches, the question is not what you want from the year. The question is what you are willing to stop carrying into it. Not the losses you could not avoid, but the weakness you have protected. The habits of thought that undermine you. The emotional dependencies that leave you exposed. This reflection is not about becoming harsh or unfeeling. It is about becoming governed by reason, by values, by a mind that is no longer at the mercy of every passing impression. Weakness, as the Stoics understood it, does not announce itself loudly. It rarely looks like collapse. More often, it looks like constant irritation, quiet anxiety, chronic dissatisfaction, or the sense that life is always happening just beyond your control. It is a condition built slowly, through small permissions given to the wrong impulses, and small neglects of reason that feel harmless in the moment. Epictetus warned that people are disturbed not by events, but by the judgments they form about events. This is not a comforting idea. It removes the excuse that suffering is imposed entirely from the outside. It places responsibility where many would rather not look, in the way the mind interprets, resists, clings, and reacts. Modern life encourages confusion here. You are taught to believe that your emotional state is primarily shaped by circumstances, by politics, by the economy, by other people's behavior, by your past, by your upbringing. While these things influence your experience, Stoicism insists that they do not command your inner life unless you grant them that authority. Weakness begins when you forget this distinction, when you treat what is external as if it were internal, when you act as though your peace depends on outcomes you cannot govern, when you allow events to dictate your character rather than test it. Consider how often anger arises because reality refuses to align with expectation. Someone speaks carelessly, plans change, effort goes unrewarded. In each case, the pain is intensified by a silent demand that the world should behave differently for your comfort. The Stoics saw this demand as the root of emotional slavery. Seneca wrote that we suffer more often in imagination than in reality. This is especially true now. The mind rehearses future losses, insults not yet delivered, failures not yet confirmed. Anxiety thrives where judgment runs ahead of facts. A weak mind does not pause to examine these impressions. It accepts them as truth and reacts accordingly. Stoic discipline begins with refusal. Refusal to immediately believe every thought. Refusal to surrender emotional authority to external noise. Refusal to confuse intensity with importance. This does not mean suppressing emotion or pretending indifference. It means subjecting impressions to reason before granting them power, asking, calmly and without drama, whether what has occurred truly threatens your character or merely your preferences. Much of what people call suffering is the frustration of desire, wanting things to be easier, faster, fairer, more predictable, wanting recognition without vulnerability, success without discomfort, security without uncertainty. These desires are understandable, but they are also dangerous when left unchecked. The Stoics observed that desire, when aimed at externals, places the mind in a permanent state of dependence. If your well-being rests on outcomes, you will always be vulnerable to disappointment. If it rests on reputation, you will be governed by other people's opinions. If it rests on comfort, you will avoid the very challenges that strengthen you. Weakness, then, is not about lacking strength, it is about misplacing it, pouring energy into resisting what cannot be changed, while neglecting the discipline required to change what can. Social pressure intensifies this confusion. You are surrounded by constant comparison, curated images of success, outrage cycles, and moral posturing. Opinions are broadcast with confidence, rarely with reflection. The temptation is to absorb this noise, to react, to identify with it, to let it shape your emotional climate. Marcus Aurelius warned against this very tendency. He advised withdrawing into oneself, not to escape responsibility, but to regain perspective, to remember that most things people are frantic about have no bearing on virtue, and therefore no claim on your peace. Weakness persists when you outsource judgment, when you let trends, crowds, or impulses decide what matters. Strength begins when you reclaim that role, when you choose, deliberately, what deserves your attention and what does not. This is not easy work. The Stoics never claimed it was. They insisted it was necessary, because without this inner governance, life becomes reactive. Each day is shaped by whatever provokes you most strongly. Anger follows insult. Fear follows uncertainty. Envy follows comparison. Relief follows distraction. None of this is chosen, it simply happens. To live this way is exhausting, and many people mistake this exhaustion for the natural condition of life. It is not. It is the condition of an untrained mind. The Stoic path begins by noticing where your reactions are automatic, where emotion leaps ahead of reason, where you feel compelled rather than deliberate. These moments reveal the contours of weakness, not as shame, but as information. When you are offended, ask what expectation was violated. When you are anxious, ask what outcome you are trying to control. When you are resentful, ask what desire has been frustrated. Each question returns you to the same center, your judgments. The world will continue to be uncertain. People will continue to disappoint. Effort will not always be rewarded. None of this is new. What matters is whether you meet these facts with clarity or with resistance. Carrying weakness into another year does not require catastrophe. It requires only inattention, a failure to examine the mind that interprets events and the values that guide action. Stoicism does not promise comfort. It offers something more durable, steadiness. A way of living where your inner state is shaped less by what happens and more by how you choose to respond. This steadiness is not passive. It is active, disciplined, and earned through practice. To begin strengthening the mind, you must first stop defending its habits. Stop justifying reactions as unavoidable. Stop confusing intensity with truth. Stop waiting for conditions to improve before taking responsibility for your inner life. The Stoics believed that philosophy was not something you read, but something you live. Each day offers countless opportunities to practice, in traffic, in conversation, in disappointment, in silence. Each moment asks the same quiet question. Will you respond by impulse or by reason? Weakness survives where this question is ignored. Strength begins where it is faced honestly, again and again, without self-deception. If weakness begins with confused judgment, it is sustained by undisciplined desire. The Stoics understood that the mind is shaped not only by what it fears, but by what it wants. Desire, when left unexamined, quietly governs behavior. It determines where attention goes, what compromises are made, and how much freedom is surrendered without protest. Modern desire is rarely simple. It is layered with comparison, abstraction, and imagined futures. You are encouraged to want not only comfort, but admiration, not only stability, but recognition, not only enough, but more than others. These desires are presented as natural, even necessary. Stoicism treats them with caution. Epictetus taught that freedom is not achieved by acquiring what you want, but by wanting only what depends on you. This idea runs directly against modern instinct. You are told to pursue outcomes, to chase validation, to secure guarantee. The Stoic response is not to condemn desire, but to refine it, to redirect it toward character, judgment, and action. Things that cannot be taken away by chance or other people. Attachment forms when desire fixes itself on externals as if they were essential. A job becomes not just work, but identity. Approval becomes not just pleasant, but necessary. Comfort becomes not just a preference, but a requirement. The more essential these externals feel, the more power they gain over your emotional life. This is why small disruptions can feel unbearable. A critical comment unsettles the day. A delay triggers irritation. Uncertainty produces constant background anxiety. The problem is not the event itself, but the dependence it exposes. When inner stability relies on conditions, stability becomes fragile. Stoic discipline addresses this fragility through voluntary restraint, not as punishment, but as training. By occasionally denying yourself what is pleasant, you learn that you are not governed by it. By accepting discomfort without complaint, you weaken the false belief that ease is necessary for well-being. Seneca practiced this deliberately. He lived simply at times, even when wealthy, to remind himself that fortune could not threaten his peace. The exercise was not about austerity for its own sake. It was about freedom from fear. A person who knows they can endure less is not easily intimidated by loss. In modern life, this principle applies quietly, but constantly. It applies when you choose not to check for approval, when you sit with boredom instead of escaping it, when you resist the impulse to react publicly to every provocation, when you allow uncertainty to exist without rushing to resolve it emotionally. Desire also distorts time. It pulls attention into imagined futures, where satisfaction finally arrives. Once this happens, the present becomes something to endure rather than inhabit. The Stoics warned against this habit. They emphasized attention to the present moment, not as mindfulness, but as responsibility. The present is the only place where reason can act. An undisciplined mind is always elsewhere. It replays past grievances. It anticipates future rewards. It compares its position to others. In doing so, it neglects the one task it always has: to respond well to what is in front of it now. Social pressure intensifies these tendencies. You are shown constant signals of what is supposedly valuable: wealth, influence, visibility, certainty. The danger is not that these things exist, but that they quietly redefine success. Character is displaced by appearance, integrity by alignment, thought by reaction. Marcus Aurelius cautioned himself against this pull. He reminded himself that applause is noise, that reputation is unstable, and that time will erase both praise and blame. What remains, he wrote, is how you lived, and whether you acted in accordance with reason. This reminder is especially necessary now. Weakness thrives where identity is built on external confirmation. where self-worth fluctuates with attention, where disagreement feels like threat. Stoic practice reverses this orientation. It asks you to locate your worth in how you govern yourself. This does not mean withdrawing from society or abandoning ambition. It means choosing ambition carefully. Ambition aimed at virtue strengthens the mind. Ambition aimed at control over others weakens it. The Stoics did not reject effort. They rejected attachment to results. Work, then, becomes an arena for practice rather than validation. Relationships become places to exercise patience, honesty, and restraint rather than sources of emotional rescue. Difficulty becomes training rather than injustice. Weakness persists when desire outruns discipline. When you say yes to impulses that undermine your long-term stability, when you avoid necessary discomfort in favor of short-term relief, each such decision feels small, but together they shape the mind's posture toward life. Stoicism asks for a different posture, one that values inner order over outer reward, one that treats pleasure as optional, not essential, one that meets loss without collapse and success without intoxication. This posture is not adopted through affirmation or belief. It is built through repeated, often quiet choices, choosing restraint when indulgence is available, choosing silence when reaction is tempting, choosing effort when avoidance feels easier. These choices rarely draw attention. They do not announce transformation, but they slowly change what you depend on. Over time, desire loses its urgency, attachment loosens, the mind becomes less desperate for reassurance and more capable of standing alone. This is not detachment from life. It is engagement without entanglement, the ability to participate fully without being possessed by outcomes, to care without clinging, to act without needing guarantees. As the year approaches, the question is not what you will gain, but what you will continue to depend on. Weakness is carried forward when desire remains unexamined. Strength emerges when you learn to want less of what you cannot control and more of what you can become. There is a point where discipline and desire meet reality, not the reality you planned for, but the one that arrives without warning. Loss, injustice, illness, failure, aging, death. The Stoics never treated these as abstract ideas. They treated them as certainty. To live well, they argued, you must prepare the mind not for comfort, but for encounter. Weakness becomes most visible when fate interrupts expectation, when effort does not prevent loss, when virtue does not guarantee reward, when the world proves indifferent to fairness. Many people respond to this by hardening into bitterness or dissolving into resignation. Stoicism offers neither response. It offers acceptance without surrender. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself daily that he would meet interference, ingratitude, arrogance, and dishonesty, not as a pessimistic exercise, but as preparation. By anticipating difficulty, he removed its power to shock. What surprises the mind often overwhelms it. What is expected can be met with composure. Modern culture avoids this preparation. It encourages the belief that things should improve steadily, that progress is owed, that suffering is an error to be corrected, rather than a condition to be met. When reality contradicts this belief, people feel betrayed by life, by others, by fate itself. The Stoics rejected this framing. They understood fate not as cruelty, but as structure. Events unfold according to causes beyond individual control. To demand otherwise is to argue with reality, and arguing with reality, they believed, is the most exhausting form of resistance. Acceptance, in the Stoic sense, does not mean approval. It means recognition, seeing clearly what is happening, without adding judgment that it should not be so. This clarity allows for appropriate action. Complaining clouds judgment. Denial delays response. Only acceptance opens the path to reasoned choice. Injustice presents a particular challenge.
The world does not reward virtue consistently. People act unfairly and prosper. Others act honorably and suffer. This unsettles those who expect moral symmetry. Stoicism does not promise it. Instead, it draws a firm boundary between moral worth and external outcome. Seneca argued that a good person remains good even when treated badly, and that no one can be harmed in their character without consent. This is a demanding idea. It refuses the comfort of victimhood. It insists that dignity is maintained by conduct, not by circumstance. This does not excuse wrongdoing. It clarifies responsibility. You are responsible for acting justly. Others are responsible for their actions. Confusing these roles leads to anger and despair. Keeping them distinct preserves agency. Mortality sharpens all of this. The Stoics reflected often on death, not to cultivate fear, but to cultivate proportion. Time is limited. Bodies fail. Projects end. Reputations fade. Remembering this does not cheapen life. It concentrates it. Marcus Aurelius wrote that you could leave life at any moment, and that this thought should determine what you do and say. This is not a threat. It is a focusing lens.
When you remember that time is finite, trivial grievances lose urgency. Meaningless pursuits lose their grip. What remains is how you use the attention you have. Weakness persists when mortality is avoided. When life is treated as endless rehearsal, when difficult conversations are postponed indefinitely, when growth is delayed under the assumption of more time later. Stoic practice interrupts this illusion. Endurance then becomes central. Not endurance as grim persistence, but as steady presence through difficulty. The ability to remain oriented toward reason when emotions surge, to hold to principle when convenience tempts, to continue acting well even when outcomes disappoint. This endurance is not innate, it is trained. Each time you choose not to dramatize pain, each time you refuse to turn hardship into identity, each time you respond to loss without self-pity, you strengthen the mind's capacity to remain upright under pressure. The Stoics did not promise tranquility through withdrawal. They lived in political turmoil, exile, illness, and uncertainty. Their calm was not the absence of struggle, but the result of alignment between values and actions, between expectations and reality. Fate will continue to rearrange your plans. Bodies will age. Efforts will meet limits. None of this can be negotiated away. What can be shaped is the manner in which you meet it. To carry weakness into another year is to continue arguing with what is inevitable. To carry strength is to meet inevitability with preparedness, not knowing what will happen, but knowing how you will respond. This is the quiet power Stoicism offers. Not control over life, but control over oneself. Not immunity from pain, but resistance to despair. Not certainty, but steadiness. When fate arrives, as it always does, the question will not be whether you are spared difficulty. It will be whether your mind has been trained to meet it without collapse. As the year turns, nothing outside you is required to change for this work to begin. The world will remain unstable. People will remain inconsistent. Events will continue to unfold without consulting your preferences. Stoicism does not ask you to wait for better conditions. It asks you to meet the conditions that exist with a steadier mind. Carrying weakness forward is rarely a conscious decision. It happens through avoidance, through distraction, through the quiet belief that tomorrow will somehow demand less of you than today. Strength, by contrast, is built deliberately. It is built when you choose clarity over comfort, restraint over impulse, and responsibility over resentment. The Stoics believed that the quality of a life is determined not by what happens, but by how consistently reason governs response. This governance is not rigid or cold. It is humane, measured, and deeply practical. It allows you to engage with life without being consumed by it, to care without losing balance, to endure without hardening. 2026 does not need a different version of you driven by urgency or fear. It needs a more governed one. A mind less reactive, less dependent on reassurance, less surprised by difficulty. A mind that understands what is within its power and accepts what is not without complaint. This is not a transformation that announces itself. It will not draw applause. Most of its victories will be invisible. But over time, you will notice a difference. Fewer emotional spikes, quicker recoveries, clearer priorities, a growing sense that your inner state belongs to you again. Stoicism is not something you adopt once and set aside. It is a daily practice, a continual return to first principles, a willingness to examine thought, refine desire, and accept fate without surrendering agency. If this way of thinking resonates, remain here. Use this space not as escape, but as reminder, a place to return to reason when the world grows loud, a place to strengthen the mind, quietly, without performance. The work does not begin in a new year. It begins in the next decision.